My presentation looks at the role of the imaginary West on people's intentions to migrate, on their aspirations, and then by following a group of Bulgarian migrants to the UK, I'm looking at also how their experiences in the UK make them re-examine, negotiate their migration projects in a way that reproduces this Western imaginary. So this is a work based on my PhD project, which is still in process. All feedback is very welcome. So first I'll start with a short introduction on the trends, migration trends from Bulgaria to the UK. Recently, which is also confirmed by my field work, we witnessed an increase of the desire of people. More and more people are willing to leave the country. Also, more and more people are approving of those who have left the country in the recent years, which is quite different from what we had in the 90s, where actually patriotic attitudes were much more expressed. So the most preferred migration destinations nowadays are the UK and Germany, whereas before pre-2009 economic crisis it was Spain, Italy and Greece. So London was actually named as the most preferred place to live among Bulgarians who live in and outside of the country in a recent survey. So my question here is how can we explain this growing popularity of the UK as the top most preferred migration destination among Bulgarians, and the growing desire of people to move especially to the UK? And this giving the recent anti-immigration campaign that for sure produced a lot of fear and anxiety among Bulgarians, and also giving the fact that most of Bulgarian migrants in the UK are actually very vulnerable to exploitation, precariousness and all kinds of hardships that they encounter here. Because of course most of the people who come here, as opposed to the media and political discourse in Bulgaria, which very often talks about the problem with brain drain and how we should to worry about the young and educated fleeing the country, the actual thing is that most of the Bulgarians who migrate are going into low-skill occupations and work as laborers, cleaners, carers or sex workers. So the predominant models of explaining migration from Eastern Europe to the West have relied on these push-pull models where structural inequalities between different places of course matter. So migration is part of this general migration trend of people from the periphery moving into the center. The other micro-level approach talks more about the rational economic reasons that individuals have. However, none of these approaches, I don't think it really explains the complexity, the heterogeneity of the migration decision-making process. So what I'm proposing here is that we should actually look more at the so-called non-rational explanations behind migration, and these were made very important during my fieldwork. So people would very often give reasonings that had nothing to do with actually rational reasons, and we should look at the ideological historical links between different places and the importance of these imaginary places that entice people to migrate. So very often the hopes and the expectations, the aspirations of people are actually contained in the workings of these wider cultural imaginaries. So if we actually pay attention to how these imaginaries work, we can disentangle the multiple reasonings that people use, and also not lose sight of the broader structural picture that of course shapes migration. So how do I theorize this imaginary West? I think of it as a collective sense-making of reality, along with Castoriadis, Gaunkar, Strauss and others. So it's kind of a symbolic matrix that provides a meaning, and it's also reflected in our dispositions, in our actions. So it is structuring the collective, but it's also of course structured by the collective. And also this Western imaginary, I think it's part of a global modern imaginary which is underpinned by Western values and by capitalism. So of course there are local context that we should also keep in mind here, but I'll skip that explanation because I don't have the time. So if you want to trace the symbolic importance of this Western imaginary in Bulgaria and its durability, we need to go back in history and to actually look at the historical context of the formation of this Western imaginary. And very briefly here, we can go back to the 19th century and see that this Western imaginary was present in the state building project and the liberation of Bulgarians, then very active during the Cold War, the socialist period in which the West was at the same time stigmatized and fetishized as the ultimate object of desire, as some would say, and in the post-socialist period when we have the most intense ideological work in implementing this Western imaginary that led the whole transitioning process in Bulgaria and I believe in other East European countries. So the whole narrative of catching up with Europe was based on this idea of the West as the ultimate standard for social, political, economic development. And after Bulgaria's EU accession and even before that, people became quite disillusioned with the whole transition process. So what happened is that, as Ferguson would say, they lost this developmental optimism. So the West, as the telos for these evolutionarist theories, actually lost its prominence. So people would say that our country would never reach that standard. We already know this. But that doesn't mean that this image of the West was delegitimized as the object of attraction. So people would devise individual strategies in order to get to the West. And this most legitimate and widespread strategy became migration. Okay, so now I would like to disentangle this, deconstruct this image of the West as it was presented in the narratives of my informants. So although they presented quite homogeneous, idealized vision of this West, however, we could differentiate between different ideas related to the West with accordance to their social positioning, the social capitals at their disposal, their personal experiences, of course. So here I would like to talk about the West as normality first. So this narrative was put forward by those people in my sample who identified themselves as people like us, meaning the typical, the normal Bulgarian people. So these were the people who have enjoyed quite stable life in socialist times, and these were the people who in the literature are called the losers of the transition. So the people who suffered the most of these post-socialist reforms. So these people saw the West as normality, and they used the concept of normal lives. And what did they mean by this concept? So this concept was an utopian combination between some experienced or idealized concepts of the past, of the socialist past, and also combined some liberal democratic values and materiality. So first, this socialist part of this normality, the West as normality concept. So they focused explicitly on predictability and security. What people wanted is to have this very smoothly transitioning life cycle. So you get your education, then you start your job, you form a family, and then you can ensure the same predictable life cycle for your children. So this is what they were missing, and this is what they projected in the West as normality. Also, for them it was very important to have a stable employment, stable income, and generally that sense of meaning in your life and sense of vision for the future, so sense of purpose, to be able to predict your steps further. And this was what they saw as impossible in their current lives in Bulgaria. Also, the security that they projected in the West revolved around this general welfare state, so free healthcare, free education. Also, one of the most desired and remembered provisions of the socialist past was to be able to afford 2 holidays per year, as this quote presents. And the other aspect of this West as normality imaginary was contained in the liberal democratic elements, which were expressed in a desire for strong regulations and rule of law. So my informants believe that in the Western societies are organized according to very strict rules and laws, and everyone follows them. It's basically people abide to them and follow the traditions which have remained unchanged for centuries and centuries. Also, they have this vision of They have this vision of Western materiality and the average middle class standard that they were aspiring to. So they believe that everyone in the West has a house and has a car, and this is what they wanted for themselves as well. So this imaginary discourse is contained in three temporal modalities. First, it is a remembrance and nostalgia for the past. Then it's a projection forward looking to the future, to the West. But it's also always constructed with relations to the present. So always constructed as a position to the present absurdity and abnormality of life in Bulgaria. And for more information on that, Steffi Jansen, Yearnings in the Meantime, his new book, provides a very thorough discussion of this aspect of normality. So the West as the American dream was another aspect of this imaginary of the West that was put forward mostly by those of my sample who self-identified as part of the new middle class, the creative class in Bulgaria. And here is one picture that someone of my informants shared on Facebook because the role models of this creative class were Steve Jobs, Margaret Thatcher, Richard Branson. So this picture says there is no reason why you cannot follow your heart. And apparently that's what Steve Jobs said at some point. So these were the people who saw themselves as having successfully transitioned to this new personhood that Elizabeth Dunn talks about. So this new mode of entrepreneurial person that the post-socialist change required. So their idea of the West as the American dream, and I need to say that here the American dream has nothing to do with America. It was completely projected in the UK or Germany. But these were the main countries, or the Scandinavians for some cases. So the West as the American dream revolves around ideas of success, meritocracy, and individuality. Success here is understood as this not just material, economic well-being, but also as this more deeper spiritual inner harmony and personal satisfaction. So this idea of, it's not just about earning good money, but you also need to be satisfied with what you're doing. Also, this idea of success has some magical aura around it, as people would often tell me that always make references to Hollywood movies that they were seeing, and would always tell me that, I believe that someone will notice me at some point. So if you're at the right place at the right time, there is no way that you cannot make it. And this is what Cullen has called this personal fulfillment myth. Also, the West as meritocracy, of course, this success was so attainable because people believe that the Western society is very meritocratic society, so everyone gets the equal chance of achieving their best according to their skills, abilities, and talents. So my informants in this group finally believe that they will play on the equal playing field and their efforts will be finally recognized and they will receive the recognition that was denied to them in Bulgaria, where they believed upward social mobility depends very much on nepotistic networks. And also this idea of individualism, my informants really valued this idea of personal freedom, freedom of expression. So here individualism is to be understood not just in this sense of self-made men, the idea that yes, I want to make it on my own, I don't want to rely on anyone's help, but also it was this idea of being able to freely express your individuality and to be your true self, because this part of my informants really believed that they're always under the scrutinizing eye of the typical Bulgarians, and they're restricted by the traditional Bulgarian norms in the society, and they're always a subject of envy and gossip. So they believe that once going to the West, they'll be actually able to express themselves without fearing any social condemnation. Okay, so now I would like to talk a bit more about what happens with this imaginary West after people leave Bulgaria and actually come to the UK. So what happens is that people are very often very much disappointed with their realization of what life in the UK actually is about. So there is a very painful process of experiencing this gap between pre-migration imaginaries and the reality on the ground. But because very often, of course, as I said, Bulgarians are very vulnerable to exploitation, and despite of their educational levels, or their social background, they very often go into this low-skilled employment and become cheap supply of ready manpower in the economy. So, and this, I have to say that this has been the case even post-2014, as the restrictions for Bulgarian workers and Romanians have dropped after 2014. I found that people actually, the situation for the people hasn't changed much, and there were still very formal and informal curbs that Bulgarians were facing, and also that was not the case for the previous generations of EU migrants in the UK. So people would experience this dissatisfaction, but actually they would never refute their pre-migration imaginaries as illusionary. And they will start negotiating, re-examining their migration projects in using this self-blame rhetoric and assuming personal responsibility for their assumed failure. So they'll always say, well, maybe it was my fault, I didn't put enough effort, but next time I'll try harder. And basically that's how performatively this Western imaginary was reproduced in their migrations. And also, of course, this Western imaginary is very much reproduced in public media discourses and in the narratives of the returned migrants. So I don't want to suggest here that people are just naively believing this Western utopia, but there are reasons why people are not expressing openly their dissatisfaction. And this is one of the rare cases in which one of my informants actually publicly expressed her disillusionment with the West. And I will not read it, but you can follow the quote. So I'm trying to explain this phenomena of this resilience of the Western imaginary by referring to Sloterdijk and Žižek and what Sloterdijk call the enlightened false consciousness. So the idea that yes, people know what they're doing, but they're still doing it. So why are they still doing it? And I believe the reasons behind that, we really need to go into psychoanalysis here, but one of the reasons that at least I discovered might be that this performative reproduction of this imaginary functions to alleviate subjective anxieties and also to provide this sense of meaning and purpose in life that people really need. So, yeah, thank you.